Given what happened in the 2020 election, the Republican National Committee this year was keenly, and I believe rightly, focused on efforts to maintain election integrity. So on Tuesday, the RNC deployed around 230,000 poll watchers to sites all across the nation. And also, in addition to that, among the frontline election integrity defenders were the Trump campaign's team of lawyers who quickly worked to tackle any problems as they arose. Well, as a result of these efforts, hundreds of election night issues were successfully resolved. And I'm saying that again, literally hundreds of issues. And here now to share more about all this is Mike Berry. He's the executive director for the Center for Litigation at America First Policy Institute. Mike, welcome back to the program. Always great to have you.
It's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
All right. So listen, it was amazing what was accomplished. Give us an overall valuation from your perspective on how things went Tuesday, specifically as it relates to election integrity.
Well, I'll sort of give people an inside view of what was happening at AFPI's Center for Litigation. In the weeks leading up to November 5th, one of the things that we did was looked at all the cases that we currently had and essentially wanted to put them into a holding pattern because we wanted to clear the decks and ensure we had sufficient bandwidth and capacity to handle whatever the issues that might arise on November 5th and possibly even 1 week, 2 weeks, even 3 or 4 weeks after November 5th, because we just weren't sure whether this was going to end up in a contested election, whether there were going to be flare-ups in some of the usual hotspots around the country. And so as the results began to come in on the evening of November 5th, I mean, first of all, the victory in itself is nothing short of remarkable. But second, the fact that we knew relatively early on that this was going to be a win and that it wasn't going to be contested, that President Trump was going to essentially win both the popular vote and the Electoral College in a landslide is just nothing short of remarkable and amazing. And to your point, Jody, hats off to his campaign, hats off to the RNC and the RNLA, the Republican National Lawyers Association. They were ready. We vowed that we cannot let what happened in 2020 happen again. And I would dare say that we are by no means where we want to be or aspire to be, but we are light years ahead of where we were 4 years ago. And that was reflected in the results on Tuesday night and the fact that this was a relatively quiet and clean, and it was a runaway landslide election.
It was relatively quiet, I think, at least from the perspective of those of us who were just watching the results come in, but there were literally hundreds of stories that were taking place behind the scenes. What were some of the issues that you heard about that came up?
Well, you go through the usual suspects of states that have some issues that arise. And I'll point out, a lot of times this is really simply due to the way that each state has its election codes written. Pennsylvania is somewhat notorious for having an election code that has some gaps, right, that leaves some room for interpretation. So both sides can sort of say, well, we interpret it this way and we interpret it this way. Georgia is another state that's susceptible to that. And that's why you kind of hear the usual suspects come up. But, looking at Pennsylvania, for example, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, early voting was a really big deal this year. There was a massive effort to get the early vote out to avoid long lines on Tuesday, but then also just to really take advantage of the early voting season. And one of the issues that happened in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, was that it became viral on social media and even in the mainstream media. You had election workers begin closing the early voting stations at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they were supposed to stay open until 5. And when asked, why are you closing the election places, they said, well, we're worried that we won't be able to handle all of the ballots that we'll have to process through early voting. And the way Pennsylvania does it, again, it's kind of weird. You stand in line, and then you get essentially what's called an on-demand mail-in ballot. Then you fill it out, and then you mail it in, and that's how they do early voting in Pennsylvania. It's different in other places. Here in Texas, we do early voting it looks and feels a lot like your regular voting, where you stand in line and you go into the little polling place and you fill out your ballot and then you submit it and then you're done. You've early voted. In Pennsylvania, they do it via what's called an on-demand mail-in ballot. Well, when they closed this down, the RNC immediately sued Bucks County and said, you can't do that. You've got to let people have the opportunity to get to engage in the early voting process from start to finish. The court agreed, issued an order saying if they are in line by 5 p.m., then they get to go through the whole early voting process. Well, lo and behold,
Wow.
on the last day of early voting, which would have been, I think, Friday before, so what is that, November 1st or 2nd, I think it was, you had these election officials again closing down the polling stations early. This time we were ready, right? Unlike in years past, this time we were ready. We made sure that the right people there on the ground had a copy of that court order in hand. They showed it to the election worker, the election officials, and said, you have to let them vote. There's a court order that says you have to, if they're in line by 5 p.m., you have to let them get access and do the full early voting process. And that's exactly what happened. So that's just one quick example of how we were very quickly able to, hear about an issue, respond to the issue, make sure that the right information, a good court ruling was already in place, and we were able to put out some of these, little brush fires before they turn into wildfires.
And y'all were prepared. I mean, and prepared to do it quickly, and that happened time and again. Mike, we've got less than a minute left, but just a scale of 1 to 10, have we made significant improvements from 2020 to 2024? And what are 2 or 3 highlight issues that still need to be resolved going forward?
We're light years ahead of where we were in 2020. I would say on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to 2020, we're probably at a 7 or an 8. We want to be at a 10, so we've got work to do. And then in terms of the areas for improvement, just like I said, the state legislatures and the AGs and the secretaries of state and some of these usual hotspots, I think there's some work to be done there in filling in some of these gaps in the election codes that need to be filled in. So I think that's probably the first step.
Mike Berry, thank you so much. Executive Director of the Center for Litigation at AFPI. Always great to talk with you. Thanks for a job well done. And thank you for joining us on Washington Watch today.
Thanks for having me.